Welcome back to Raised by Giants live discussion. Welcome everyone in the chat. Good to see you guys and any moderators and channel members out there. We have an amazing show for you guys here today, and we are live. But a quick reminder, super chats and super stickers are available and will be read out live during the show. If you have any questions that you would like addressed, that's the best way to get them answers. Send in those super chats, baby, and buy me a coffee. And PayPal links are also in the description and are a great way to help support the show and my work. And also, Ryder Ranger channel memberships are available and are a fantastic way to help support the show monthly. And if you become a Ryder Rangers channel member, you'll get access to bonus weekly episodes. A new episode will be dropping tomorrow, this Friday, and you're not going to want to miss that. So become a Ryder Rangers channel member today and help support the show monthly. And check out the community tab on the page to get access to those episodes. So with that down, a warm welcome back. A friend of the show, Shane the Ruiner. Good to see you, my friend.
What is up, man? How are you?
Good, dude. Just when you think you figured out the secret space program, bro, like something else pops up and it's like, wow, a mind blower. And it was interesting because I seen this documentary pop up on Netflix and I was like, it's called, here's a picture of it. The program, Cons, Cults, and Kidnapping. This is primarily what we're going to be discussing this evening is this Netflix documentary series that came out just a little over a week ago. And I saw it on there and I was like, okay, well, Netflix has been doing some really interesting stuff as of recent. They did the Rael Alien Prophet documentary, which I covered in UFO Doomsday Cults Part 2 or 3, I believe. And I was like, they've been doing a lot of stuff with cults here recently. So I started watching this documentary and I'm like, holy crap. I actually couldn't believe that it was on Netflix. And they've been doing a lot of really good stuff. They just came out with another one called American Conspiracy, the Octopus Murders, which is a whole other huge rabbit hole to go down. But as soon as I got done watching this documentary, it's a 3-part series, 3-episode series. And I sent everyone that I possibly could think of, like, to watch this documentary. And I messaged you and I was like, dude, you got to watch this documentary. It makes so much more sense now. And you were like, I just watched it. I was like, wow, what a synchronicity there. So I guess give us your thoughts without giving too much of the plot away because we're going to get into it as we're going along here tonight. Your initial thoughts on this documentary?
Well, my initial thoughts were actually just a pure annoyance because I kept seeing that picture getting shared all over the place with some kind of commentary attached to it that I didn't think was appropriate for what I knew the series was going to be about. And so I was a little bit annoyed right from the beginning. I almost wasn't going to watch it, but then I decided to watch it because I was so annoyed. And I have mixed feelings after having watched it, but I'm glad that it's out there for sure. I've been saying for a long time with related to these programs that some of them get confused with WASP programs, and everyone kept pointing me back to the secret space program being like, yeah, WASP programs. I was like, no, not those programs, but these programs and the behavioral modification programs for the troubled teen industry that popped up mid to late 90s, ran really hard into the early 2000s, and still run to this day. So for that reason, I'm very glad that this got made because that's what they're discussing.
Yeah, and as soon as from the first episode, they talk about how their parents basically pay this company, this behavioral modification company that runs these facilities. Parents pay these companies money to come in and abduct their children in the middle of the night. Some of them were tied up and they'll wake up in like 3 in the morning and with 2 gentlemen standing over them and tell them that they need to come with them. And then they get into a blacked out SUV. Then they go to one of these facilities and they don't know what's going on. They have a majority of them just was not told about this process and what was going to happen to them. And I'm like, That sounds very similar to what a lot of these secret space program super soldier people talk about, being abducted in the middle of the night, blindfold, not knowing where they're going, and they go to some facility. I'm like, well, the trauma of that, and we've spoken about trauma several times before and how our brains can, create something based on trauma that didn't actually really happen. So I know that you've spoken a little bit, you've made comments about um, behavioral modification groups. I think even on the show, I'd have to go back and listen to some of our past episodes, but you've spoken kind of fluently about it. Just like, yeah, some of these programs are like just behavioral modification programs. So, what is that initial, because that's the first thing that they really talk about, and Paris Hilton had this exact same thing happen to her as well, and she was taken to a facility in, New Mexico, Provolo, or something like that, that starts with P. What's it called?
I think it's Provo Island, Provo Island, yeah, something like that.
Yeah, Provo, something like that, and I think that it's in, New Mexico, I believe. Either in New Mexico or, Arizona. But this has happened to, it seems like, a lot of people. And this documentary mostly focuses on upstate New York at this facility called Ivory Ridge. So, what do you think about this? Because it's obviously illegal to do that. Like you can't pay a company to come and kidnap your child. Like, and they plainly say that they're kidnapping people, especially in this other documentary that you told me about to watch. I'm going to bring this right here, Hell Camp, which is another Netflix original documentary. Like the uh, the wife of the guy that ran this camp that was in Utah straight up said that they were kidnapping and abducting children.
Yeah, it's human trafficking, it's kidnapping, it's child abuse, it's all over the place, and it still happens. It has been happening, like I said, since mid 90s. And yeah, the MO is usually the same. The thing that I wanted to point out before I forget is that we aren't talking about teens who are like heavily troubled. Like even the girl who made the program documentary, I think she said what they caught her with a Mike's Hard Lemonade, right? Like it was a very minimum thing. It's not like she had an ongoing history of violence or maladjusted behavior in any sort of way. It was just parents being like, I don't want to deal with my kids, essentially. Before they had the potent version of the internet to take over that parental role, this was just a different version of that. And the significant part of it is that they went after the parents. And the documentary did a good job of pointing that out as well, that they would induct the parents into a what is essentially a cult and convince them that they need to do this. And then, yeah, all of the cult-like behavior plays out before that. But before we kind of get into it, the reason why I was kind of annoyed is just the name, the program, which obviously that's no fault of the lady who made this. She did a great job with the documentary. I'm glad she made it. And she's not in on it. She just called it the program because that makes sense because they repeat those words, the program, the program, the program. Could have very easily been called the academy, could have been called the academies or a bunch of other things, but um, I guess it's the new age community or the alternative community taking it as meaning the programs that we've been talking about for all of this time, right? So just to run back through that, what people call the Illuminati, it's made up of cults, projects, and programs. And they take the cults and the programs and they make projects out of them, which is all that you hear, like Project Stargate, MK Ultra, all of that type of stuff is what they've figured out by human testing in secret, very illegally, cults mixing the two together and bringing out stuff like this. And what we get to hear about is the project level of all of this stuff. So MK Ultra had stages to it that they realized they wanted to roll it out on the public, and this was one of those stages. Is these programs that they were running not only teens through this method, but it also found its way into universities and like HR programs through different corporations, and a lot of different things ended up being molded after this, which is if you watch this, you're going to hear a lot of parallels between this and things like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, like all of these programs, right? So that's where my annoyance came from. But overall, they show you the model of how this all works, and they do show what I've been saying about how they've been taking what they learned through the underground experimentation, MK Ultra, and then putting that into a public sector so that we normalized it. And from there, once the technology was available, now they just do it to the public on a regular basis. But when you listen to the program that they run these kids through, you're really going to hear the echoes of that.
Yeah, and it seems like 100%, especially the school in upstate New York called Ivy Ridge that I believe was shut down in 2008. Um, it was an MK Ultra school. That's what it was. All the video and the archival footage that they show in the documentary, the program Cons, Cults, and Kidnapping, is standard MK Ultra programming, like repeating phrases over again. There was those two girls that were reenacting the thing, like hands up, hands over, hands to the side, hands together. That whole thing, that's psychic driving. And in the Hell Camp documentary that you had me watch, which was like the precursor to a lot of these programs, uh, they talk about that. That's what they were doing. They were deprogramming these kids, then to put in another program, which is exactly what the MK Ultra programs were doing as well.
And the first one, the original one, that Hell Camp one, was done through straight up trauma. They were just marching these kids through the desert with nothing, right? And then each step, I don't know how much you watched. I don't want to give it away or make too many spoilers, but each step throughout the journey, they presented them something which seemed like it was making the journey easier, but was actually technically making the journey harder. And the kids weren't noticing that because it was presented as something that was benefiting them. It's amazing to see.
Yeah, the Hell Camp one was kind of like a PG version of the newest documentary, and kind of tried to glorify in a way the runner of the Utah wilderness behavioral modification program, where they would just have kids hiking through the mountains of Utah for like 60 days, 60, 70 days. But
Yeah.
it's the same exact premise as what they're talking about in the program Cons, Cults, and Kidnapping, is that they were also abducted, just like the kids were abducted within the Ivy Ridge programs and the programs in Arizona and possibly some in New Mexico.
Yeah, Hell Camp has that kind of anti-woke sling to it, like conservative right sling to it, where they're like kind of expressing it in a way like kids need this, and how dare they like demonize this man who presented this? But the idea is that you see the program within it. It's the same stuff we've all been talking about, and the unfortunate reality is there's a lot of people within the audience of the more extreme secret space programs, super soldier people who are talking about these and calling them programs or have memories of these. Um, they talk in the Hell Camp one about the hallucinations people would have and how they would have their like come to Jesus moments while they're out there melting in the desert. And same with the other one. And then also kind of how it left them afterwards. They were all very vulnerable, and it's like with most cults, you end up finding other cults just after you get out of the first one, right? You kind of jump out of one into another in a lot of cases, and so that was shown. And yeah, a lot of very interesting parallels between things we've been talking about over the last couple of years, I guess now, and what these kids went through.
Yeah, and in this documentary, it's they would also do the psychic driving in another way. Not only having the kids repeat phrases and like doing like actions and stuff, but they would also use music. It was commented on that they would use Stanley Kubrick's 2000, the opening of 2001: A Space Odyssey, and they would repeat it over and over and over and over again. And the people that were a part of this behavioral modification school is like, yeah, I can't even. Anytime that I hear that song, it's like I automatically am like, almost triggered back to being in this behavioral modification school,
Yep.
which is just another version of MK Ultra and the torture aspect of what they were doing to these children in these schools. And I think that the most alarming part about it, Shane, is that, see, I'd heard of these types of schools before, but I didn't really know that it was something that was still going on. I thought that it was kind of like over with. I'd heard of like camps and certain things like that. And I'd actually met a girl when I was out in California where I worked, and she said that she was at one of these schools and she was abused and that she was basically tortured, and she has like a lot of trauma surrounding. And whenever she was telling me, she was just like crying about it. I'm like, holy crap! I didn't really bring that back to my mind until I watched this documentary on Netflix, and I'm like, holy crap, this girl was, which I didn't doubt her at all because she showed me some pictures, and they were all in like a uniform, and it was like a military type. It was like dress blues. It was like they were in like dress blues, like the Navy would wear, and I was just like, holy crap, this is really a thing. And you're totally right, that the occult and ritualistic aspect of this, because this documentary really shows that the parents were being just as brainwashed as the kids were being. Like they had these parents coming in, like, what did they say, like once a month or once every week or something like that, and doing these weird rituals. They would have them cross dressing. They'd have the men dressing up as women and the women dressing up as men. And they would all stand in circles and do like weird meditations and all that. I'm like, this is wild, dude.
That's what I
Wild.
said. It was a project, which was a combination of programs and cults. The cults were there to hold the parents, and you see, I won't don't spoil it for the people who are going to watch it, but you'll see the way that they controlled the communication between everybody as well, how they kept their secrets and all of that stuff. And there's even the comment about how eventually with technology they couldn't do that anymore, and that led to a downfall of a lot of these schools. But anyways, this is what's going on: is they have the parents indoctrinated, and then the kids are indoctrinated through force, and that combination of the two of them, um, you know, we're hearing from kids in which the program didn't take as well, which you have to consider, right? How about all of the ones that it turned out that did take? That's something that we need to get really heavily consider too, because that's I already mentioned like wokeness. We were like that mentality out in the public. That's where it came from as well. Was they were programming it through that. People would then go out and then live their lives, have babies with people who are probably in those type of programs too, thereby making a new generation of people who were. It's almost like step forward wiving them in a way. That's the side that didn't take. And so a lot of different layers to what's going on there, and that was the part that I really liked, that she did her best to go down as many rabbit holes that it led to as she could, but she also made it very clear that there was a lot of stuff she just couldn't investigate because it was too much, and she would come to walls where they wouldn't let her investigate anymore. And then I'm sure that Netflix also probably threw some shit out on her as well. So I pointed out the one that was pretty obvious, that's hinted to but never actually got to, with the Clintons in there, right? And then there's other ones like that, like even the fact that they wouldn't let her come into Canada, which was telling, because I've been saying, there's a lot more activity up here but we have a communist like control up here. Sorry, Justin Trudeau is a lovely man and he's exactly the leader we need. But it's been a lot easier to control information in our country than it ever was in the States, just to begin with, and quite obviously they are still getting away with doing this in the States. But yeah, that's what it is.
Well, that's how a lot of the MK Ultra programs. That's where they went as well. They went to Canada after they were basically shut down in the United States. Noble Truth says sometimes they reward you for compliance, especially taking medication. I wonder if that's in the doc as
Yep.
well. Well, Paris Hilton talks about how they were forcing her to take medication, and then she started not taking it, and then they found it, and then she got put in isolation. And that's another really interesting thing about this. That's how they would punish these kids that didn't comply with the program, right? They would put them in like isolation in these little tiny rooms for days and
After
sometimes a
force
week.
feeding them the drugs. After
Yep.
force feeding them the drugs, exactly. They would drug them up and then they would lock them away. like that. And the only other thing that they got was just more drugs. And so, yeah, hallucinating is a interesting thing. We always think about it as, conjuring images in front of ourselves, but a lot of it just has to do with what we fill in our memory with after the fact. You hear that when you hear people talk about AIs hallucinating, because what an AI hallucinating is when it doesn't have the information, so it just makes it up. That's an AI hallucinating, and we hallucinate in the same way.
Yeah, it's so wild, the torturous conditions that these kids were in. And that's one of the things that she was like, well, once I got out of this Ivy Ridge school in New York, and then I couldn't process it. She said she didn't process it for like 4 or 5 years. She just like kept herself busy doing all this other stuff. And if you notice, whenever she's trying to talk to that one of the counselors from the school that's inside of that church, that they couldn't get video inside, they just got audio. And he's like, well, why didn't you come and do this sooner or whatever? And she was like, well, we didn't have the proof then. We didn't, because that's another level of all this, is that their parents didn't believe them, the things that they were telling them that they went through. And according to the documentary, a lot of the parents still don't believe the children, and the abuse and the mind control type scenarios that they were put into in these schools. And that also rolls into the secret space program people and the super soldier people as well, because I guarantee if you were to ask their parents, oh, do you remember Johnny being gone for 20 years and then being sent back and 20 years later as a little kid? They're going to say, no, that never happened. Just like what they're saying here, that this torture and these the mind control operations and the way that they went about treating these kids in these programs, their parents are saying, oh no, this didn't happen either.
Yeah. And this again, like with the layers, another layer, like she was only able to do it through academies, but we also had military versions of this, right? We had FBI versions of this. We had CIA versions of this. In Canada, we have what we call reform schools, different things like that run from the school through the churches, which are all very similar to, what we called residential schools for First Nations people up here in Canada. It's a pretty widespread series of programs that they're uncovering here with this documentary. But you can tell, she came up to those walls where she could only talk about what was in front of her.
Which is a good eye-opening way to just dip your toes into the entire program, and hopefully more people will investigate into it and look deeper and find other connections and other ties. But another interesting part was whenever she called, I think it was an adoption center. This was like in the second or third episode, where not the adoption center, but a behavioral health, behavioral modification school for adopted children. And the person on the phone told her that the state of California funds and sponsors this program.
Yeah. Another little thing is there's some congressional hearings that get shown in there that have to do with the schools, but the whole reason that ever got the light of day to begin with was because they were already running this probe on missing children. You remember the milk carton kids and things like that. They were already running this congressional probe on missing children, which led them to opening those files about the academies. But my point in bringing that up is this has been a feeder system for every type of human trafficking you could possibly think of. What better way than to, oh, sorry, your kid ran away. Or, maybe they died in there, but you can't see the body, because remember, they mentioned things like that, how like anytime anyone would get sick, parents weren't allowed to see them. Anytime anyone got harmed, parents weren't allowed to see them. People dying took a long time to get their children's remains back from these schools, things of that nature as well. So it does, the other whole rabbit hole of it being a feeder to the type of programs that I've been talking about all along as well, right? Again, it's because one thing they mention in that, which I know was something you wanted to bring up, so I'll let you rant on this a bit, is how it seemed like all of the kids that they were collecting were creatives.
That's right. It's commented on in this documentary that this is a way to get rid of creative children. It's a way to get rid of artists. It's a way to get rid of future thought leaders. It's a way to get rid of musicians. And I found that really interesting. There's things that's written all over the walls in this now abandoned Ivy Ridge school that's like, this is where children, this is the taker of children's souls. This is where kids' souls go to die. And that's very true. I mean, and the way that they, because it's a very traumatizing act. One, just being abducted out of your home in the middle of the night and taken to one of these facilities. And I believe that whenever the first girl said that she got there, the maker and the creator of this documentary, whenever she walked in, she was like, "Oh, well, let me go get my other bag out of the car." And they're like, "No, you're not allowed to leave. You're never allowed to go outside again." And
Well,
then all of the behavioral modification things that they weren't able to look out windows. They weren't able to talk to each other. That was the really big one that I haven't really looked into any of the other schools that were going on at that time to see if it was this brutal as the one at Ivy Ridge. But the one at Ivy Ridge, no one was allowed to talk. None of the kids were allowed to talk to each other or even look at each other. Like, how devastating would that be to a young kid's mind? Like, kids are super talkative. Kids want to talk to each other and like touch each other and have that interaction with each other. And they weren't allowed to do that. They would get like docked in, it was some kind of point system or whatever, or some kind of merit system that you had to do everything right in order to graduate up into next levels of this program. And apparently the third and fourth level of the program was completely different than the first two levels, or the way that they explained it, right? But that required you be fully accepting of everything that they were telling you to do. So all of the mind control tactics, all of the not talking, doing everything that, I mean, there's so much footage in the documentary of like harassment and abuse. What did they call it? Restraining. They call it restraining, right? Where someone would do one little thing and then they would just like sit on top of them, knock them to the ground, and then like lay on them. Or sometimes it was like 3 or 4 staff members, like with their knees on these kids. And I believe it was in that documentary as well, where one got shut down, I believe, because a kid died because he was being restrained. I think it was in that document. It was like in a cafeteria or something, and this kid like threw a cup or some food or something, and then they restrained him. Yeah.
that's a recent video. That's one that's open today. Like that was something that just happened just before that documentary actually came out. Um, but yeah, the other part that is important is the staff at these places. And because that's always a question, right? About, like who would do these type of things. Well, they give you a look into the type of people who would do these type of things and why, as well, with this documentary about people like, I'm just doing the job, or they were already fucked up people. Sorry for my language. They were already messed up people who, saw a job posting and then got into this environment where like, I'm allowed to do this to people. Sweet. Right. And
With no credentials, no certifications, none of it. It's wild. And they tried to contact a few of them, and none of them were remorseful. Well, I think one of them were. I think the one lady that they met at a restaurant where they started filming, and then they were asked to leave the restaurant. I think she was remorseful, but majority of them that contacted them, they weren't remorseful at all. Like that one girl that was a part of the documentary, that because apparently they were faking drug tests in this Ivy Ridge school, and they were saying that these kids were heavily on drugs and that they were going to die. And this one girl, her entire relationship with her family got ruined because she wasn't doing any drugs. She wasn't drinking or anything, but she went to the school and they faked a drug test on her that light up all the drugs on the drug test. And then this counselor was like calling her all these names and like harassing her and calling her a crackhead and like a drug addict and all this. And that counselor was telling her parents all this stuff. And this girl's like, I never did any of this. And then she finally got the proof. She found the drug test in the abandoned school in New York at Ivy Ridge, and then went and put the drug test in the counselor's mailbox.
And her biggest trauma was the fact that she was like the poster girl for it all too. She was the pretty young girl that they were taking all the pictures of, and one of the first with the ones like anytime they would have bring a parent to the facility, they only had select kids that they would show to the parents runs, the ones that had completed to certain levels of the program, and even to that program pyramid structure. We've all heard that before, right? Like that's not new. We know exactly where they got that idea from, but it worked exactly the same way. The only difference between that and Scientology is there isn't a monetary value involved where, if you want to get your kid into level 5, then you're going to have to pay us more money, right? Because they didn't need to do that. They were already making a shit ton of, sorry for my language, again, a ton of money by selling kids on the side, which is the thing that she again hinted at, but also made it pretty clear she wasn't allowed to talk about in the documentary.
Yeah, and the way that the parents were, because whenever they were first brought into these programs, apparently these behavioral modification schools told the parents that they're going to try and lie to you. Like, don't listen to anything that they're going to tell you about the program because they're lying, which is a crazy, wild manipulation technique just right out the gate. It puts a stop to anything that the child or the kid says bad about the place. The parent automatically assumes that they're lying and they're trying to manipulate their way out of the program.
I think one of the lines was actually, "Your children's feelings are manipulations for you." Was yeah. I was like, "Yep, that sounds about right." And yeah, that obliviousness that the parents showed, any of the parents that did get uh, put on camera there, um, you saw both sides of it. You saw the ones that were like, "Oh my God, I can't believe that happened. I'm so sorry." And then you see the other ones that still have the cult block in the place where they won't admit that it happened in their own brain. They might pretend like they accept it for their daughter or their son, whatever they're dealing. There's a lot of females in this, so their daughter, but they don't actually themselves accept that these things happened to her yet because of the cult programming in them. And that's for people like me, that's something that needs to be considered. Is they had our parents in different ways as well, where our parents didn't realize what was going on because they were actually being told something else was being going on, right? And if you trust experts, you believe them. So if an expert is telling you this is what's happening, this is the explanation for all of these things you're seeing, then you're going to go, okay, I believe you. And that was also very well shown in that documentary.
And also the amount of money, you just mentioned the amount of money that some of these behavioral modification schools were getting, and some of them were upwards of like $70,000. Dude, like $70,000 in the early 90s, that's a lot of money that they're paying out for these programs. So no wonder they don't want to believe their child, because one, they've given a crap ton of money. Two, they don't want to be scammed and it be like a fraud. Three, they don't want to believe that their child was abused in one of these programs. And four, they don't want to look like a fool.
Yeah.
And they don't want to have to apologize for putting their kid into one of these schools, because that's a very heinous act. Like, when you watch this documentary, you're going to realize that the, you would feel god awful as a parent watching the archival footage and the surveillance footage from some of these behavioral modification schools. You're going to feel like shit if you actually sent your kid to one of these schools. Like, if one of my parents ever sent me to one of these schools, I would probably never talk to them again, ever. Be like, I'm done with you guys. There ain't no way that I'm ever going to speak to you again. And that's kind of the process that the filmmaker of this documentary uh, kind of got into a little bit. She didn't speak to her dad for like the whole making of the documentary until the end, but he was pretty receptive to what she discovered. But again, there's all this proof and there's all this evidence and there's surveillance footage of children being abused and the programming that happened in these behavioral modification schools. So, like, unless you're completely blind, it doesn't take a pair of glasses to see what was going on. But again, they don't want to admit to that because then that brings on the guilt, brings on, oh well, I just freely gave all of my money, thousands and thousands of dollars, to one of these behavioral modification schools where they're torturing my child.
Yeah, it's actually a rare personality trait for people to like freely accept when they're wrong. It's really difficult for us as humans to do. We all saw that with the lollipops, right? Like the lollipops and that thing that went around over the last few years and how it's all, you know, come to light now that it was all nonsense, but nobody will believe it. It doesn't matter how much it gets put in front of their face because it means admitting how wrong they were and that this identity that they've built was false because it was built on this false foundation. And that's really, really difficult for people to do. And this is just another example, or there's several examples within that documentary of people who did the same, whether it was the parents, the facilitators, the staff involved, even some of the people involved. And yeah, very interesting that all of those same dynamics have been playing out in the mainstream media over the last 3 to 5 years.
Noble True says, an example for the audience: some staff members are promised credits in specific psych fields if they work at the program. Could be. I mean, that would make sense, right?
Yep, dangling carrots. That's what I
But
call those things.
the heinous nature that these staff members had to do to these children, like what type of, because you know they weren't paying them good money. So like, what's the incentive? The only thing that I can think of is that they wanted to do it and then they like to do it and they got their rocks off
I think it's the
doing it.
opposite. They probably were paying them really good money, but there was no background check. There was no resume check. There was no
Mm,
credentials needed. Like they were giving people jobs that should be going to PhDs just off the street because they answered a call, right? So that's, I think that they probably were paying them quite well for jobs that they should never have had to
mm,
begin with. And that's a lot of it, right? If you're totally comfortable and you're like, I'm never going to find another job like this, that's hard to quit in and of itself, right? You're everyone looks past stuff every day at their jobs, but you know, the more they pay you, the more cushy that is, or the more aligned with that type of treatment you are. That was what the one person said, is like, I liked doing this stuff anyways. You're gonna pay me to do it? Right? Like they were hiring bouncers who like beating up people to police the boys' side and be behavioral counselors for the boys' side, things like that. Yeah, it's that's the part that I think everyone always underestimates humans on, is that there are people out there who enjoy doing these kind of things. Maybe because it's been done to them, maybe because they just like it, but there are people who are more than happy to hear, "Oh, you're going to lock me up with a bunch of young boys and let me do whatever I want to them? Sweet. You're going to pay me to do that? Even
mm.
better. And all I have to do is lie? Deal."
Yeah, I wish we could have got a little bit more information about the boys' side of Ivy Ridge. There wasn't too much on there besides like archival footage of some of the boys being restrained and like abused and put into these deprivation areas for punishment.
Yep, and they brought that up too, how even between the boys and the girls' side, there was mis and disinformation to turn them against each other and make them not want to talk each other or fear. Like the girls basically were afraid of the boys because of the things that they were hearing from all of the staff. So that whole dynamic at every level of it.
And apparently there was like a riot that was trying to go down and they were all trying to escape, but instead of escaping, they all went and ate food
Right?
in the cafeteria. But I think a few of them did get out, like three or four of them got out, but then they were caught and captured later on. Because that's another part of this is like you put these camps and these behavioral modification camps, just like the one in Utah, uh, in the middle of nowhere. So if anybody does happen to try and run away, there's literally no place for them to go.
Well, the best part was with that one, if they had gone straight across the river, they ran into a Canadian version of exactly the same thing. So it was pretty funny in
Mm.
that sense too.
Yeah, and it is a Netflix documentary series. The program Cons, Cults, and Kidnapping. And there is another one that Shane told me about that we have kind of mentioned a little bit, which was Hell Camp, which is another Netflix original. This one's a movie. The program Cons, Cults, and Kidnapping is a series, is a 3-part series. But Hell Camp is really the original, or the origin of this, and it started in the 80s, right?
Yeah. Yeah, they call it the troubled teen industry.
And where they would abduct these kids and kidnap these kids and take them into the mountains of Utah and like have them walk for miles and miles and miles and miles. And uh, that program eventually got shut down because someone had died during the hike, and there was a big lawsuit, but the guy that ran the program ended up winning the lawsuit. It's
Well,
wild. And that
the reason why it's significant is because you can see how something that didn't have the agenda behind it was then very quickly grabbed a hold of and turned into something and used by other people who did have that agenda behind it, right? And that's again why they were trying to glorify that particular Stephen, whatever his name is, gentleman, is because they're just trying to get across that, this guy didn't run the kind that everybody else went to run. This was his original idea, but the formulation of it, the program within it is still the same. And again, what they're trying to push through this particular documentary is the opposite, that, these days kids need this, right? Like, these days kids don't have discipline and they don't have respect. And if you go to the original program that this movie showed, really that's what it was. And the abduction was still on the front of it, but beyond that, it was really just taking these people out to help character build. Just the extreme nature of it is what turns it into abuse, right? And then got used by all sorts of people, and it became a whole industry of them basically going to parents, oh, your teen's being a teenager? Well, we have a solution. We'll take them, give them to us, let us run some experiments on them and feed them to some monsters just to see what happens. Because what we know is the result of that is all going to become politicians one day, and facilitators or administrators at universities one day, and cops, and all of these different people who will then be easily controlled because of the program.
Yeah, and probably another reason why they kind of went easy on this Steve guy that ran all of these different the behavioral modification camps, and one was getting ready. The one at the end was getting ready to actually be turned into a facility. I believe it was in South America, maybe, or in the Congo, or somewhere out in the forest, and in
Austria,
a different.
I can't
Was
remember.
Austria? Yeah, it was somewhere.
But I don't know, somewhere down there.
But it was getting ready to be turned into like a facility, and but the guy died. He died of cancer, I believe, colon cancer. So he died like a few years before the making of this documentary. But what's interesting though is like they have all of his family members like giving interviews in this documentary, and they're talking about all the heinous acts and all the things that he did, but they're still like, "Oh, he was a good guy. He was just trying to help." Like, what do you mean? What do you mean he was just trying to help? And I understand that they're family members and some of their kids, but this guy sent his own kid to one of his own camps.
That's what I mean. It's given with this idea that like it was a good thing that went too far, kind of like, communism's just never been done properly. One of those type of things. But yeah, the origin of it is there. You can see how it got like bought up by other people, modified. AA, NA, SA, all of these different programs also spawning from this idea. In the program Netflix series, she does go through the list of the stuff that the founders of the academies, where they all came from. I think there was a trifecta of them, or there was three of them that were earlier versions of the same thing. That a cult is a cult is a cult is a cult, and so eventually it became known that it was a cult, and they had to move on, rebrand it, and come out again. Sounds a lot like our community, because that's what people have been doing since the beginning of time. When you get into like Helena Blavatsky and the Theological Society, you'll notice that it's exactly that exact game. A cult is a cult is a cult, and eventually cults get shown up. And so all they do is come up with a new name, probably move to a different town or a different geographical location. Sometimes we'll even swap out the front person, but a cult is a cult is a cult is a cult, and so eventually it's going to cult, and that's exactly what we have here.
The way that she explained this in the program, cons, cults, and kidnapping, just for people that are just listening, and there's two different documentaries. The first one came out, I believe, in 2019, which was the one that I just pulled the picture up of, which is called Hell Camp, Teen Nightmare. And then this one that's on the screen right now, the program Cons, Cults, and Kidnapping, is the newest one that just came out this month on March 5th. Now, they're different in a bunch of different ways. Not only the way that they're made, but the subject matter is basically the same. These teen behavioral health programs, but this guy that ran these camps in Utah and then spread out to South America and went to all these different places trying to open up other, because he had a really bad name over the lawsuit that he had. He hadn't quite figured out the process on how to actually get away with a lot of this stuff. He didn't have permits for any of his things. He didn't have permits to run any of these businesses. He didn't have credentials to run teen behavioral modification programs. None of that. But this guy that ran this, was the funder and the contributor to the main program that's talked about in this documentary that's up on the screen right now in New York. He had it all figured out, and he'll probably never get caught or ever get anything come to him, because he's set up all of these different shell corporations and all these different LLCs to like hide anybody ever coming after him. The lady that directed and made the documentary was like, yeah, this is a nightmare to go through and connect all these dots. She had like a CIA type of style cork board up with all the lines and everything going for each other, which I think was for the documentary, of course, but that doesn't, she definitely did the research for sure. And she's like, listen, this guy is he's almost untouchable, because he has all these companies that are set up by different names under different names. One company is owned by 4 or 5 other companies. Those 5 companies are owned by 10 to 20 other different companies, and then it just goes so on and so on down the line, which was interesting because toward the end of the documentary, she I think it was the brother of the guy that ran a lot of these programs. I think he was brother of the guy that started the WASP programs. I might be incorrect or not incorrect, but they showed up at this karaoke bar and got to see him firsthand, which I thought was actually really cool. And they got up and sung that one day I'm gonna find you, I'm gonna get you, get you, get you. And I was like, wow, that is a covert way to do it. I thought it was really clever, but I
She even
liked
took
it.
a picture with him, like, kinda dancing with him or whatever, which is way to go, lady, yeah.
Yeah, she killed it. It was a really well made documentary series. I'm gonna have to rewatch it again, and really to wrap your head around the web that has been made from all this stuff.
Oh, yeah,
Now,
like, what they were showing with that is I call it the throwing people under the bus scenario. So you have all of these different people kinda linked to it, so that eventually when you get caught, one person gets thrown under the bus and the rest get to move on. And it's like the same thing as in the mafia, one like the fall guy, right? We've heard it's or a patsy, the same idea, depending on whether they're in on it or not. And, yeah, that's exactly what they've done is they've got like every time they get caught, someone pays for it, but it's never the guy who actually did it, right? It's someone else who's just being paid more or less to be that person. And then they continue to operate until they get caught again, and that's why they can't ever get it back to him because he's got too many bodies to throw in front of that bus before it ever gets there. And they do show in the documentary, she kind of followed the money all the way as high as she could get. She got to like the Senate level, I believe, and that's where they started shutting her down. But it's implied that there are people involved, and they actually show a picture of one of the ladies very much involved in a lot of these programs over time to a lot of where the money that they're getting paid comes from. So
yes, my mind was blown when I watched it. I was like, "Holy crap! I can't believe." One, I can't believe that it happened at all, and two, I can't believe that it's still happening. It's, it's wild, and they're right. It's a money make. It's gotten so out of hand, and it's brought in so much money. And I believe that it was mentioned in one of the two documentaries that they kind of not threaten the state or the town that they're in, but they kind of go to the government officials and was like, well, if this gets shut down, then you're going to lose all of this money. There's not going to be as much money flowing into your town or into your state because this program is supplying a lot of your money and a lot of your funding.
well, that was that Ivy Ridge there. Like that town wouldn't have been there without the school anymore, right?
Yep.
So yeah, and that's what they would do is, or I guess what people didn't notice, it's not necessarily what they were doing. That's the way that they operated is they were, someone very high up the food chain was making them happen. Who they think are in charge of that are not in charge of that. They're just the people who run the organization that launders that money for them in that form, and it goes up into the government, up into people in positions in power in government.
Yeah, that's right. It was Ivy Ridge. And when you look at Ivy Ridge now, it's a disaster. It's a mess.
It's the same thing as you'd see with, like, a fishing town that no longer has fish there, or like a old oil town throughout the States, right?
Coal
Once you
mining
get
town.
coal mining towns, it's exactly the same thing. These schools worked in exactly the same way. It's the same thing that, like, you know, something like the UFC does, where it's like one of the incentives to get into the city is the fact that they're gonna bring a bunch of money, a bunch of tourism along with them. It's that same game, just on a much smaller scale for a individual little town. And of course, like, the local sheriff, the local nurses, the local doctors, the local optometrists, the local shoemakers, all of these people would have no job if there is no town. They'd all have to relocate. So anything that comes along that promises them that, we've seen this in so many different ways all across the states, throughout all the main decades from the 30s to the end of the 90s.
Well, now I think it's time to heavily get into the relation between these programs, these behavioral modification programs that are being described within the documentaries, the program Cons, Cults, and Kidnapping, and the documentary that came out before, and Hell Camp, Teen Nightmare, and the relation between that and what these secret space program people and these super soldier people call the programs, because it's almost identical. You just take aliens and space and time travel and advanced um, med beds and like all that stuff out of the equation, and you pretty much verbatim have this program that's being presented in this documentary, the program Cons, Cults and Kidnapping.
It just further reinforces my number that, if I'm being nice, 90% of the speakers are making things up, and 70% of the audience believes their own made up memories that come from something probably more like this, right? I've been pointing this out for many years that, like, even the combination of wasp and wasp, which I just, to me, that's always been almost ironic that you guys called that because that is what it is. And, anyways, at the same time, these other programs do exist, and you can see how this would be a very good way to identify people, right? But what I was saying off the top is these came second. The programs that these people are alluding to were first, and then these were kind of layered on top for a variety of different reasons. One that I've already pointed out to start rolling this out into the public. The other one is as a cover for what they were doing in the actual programs. And that was the part that was annoying me when it was like the program, the program, the program, the program, when we've been saying the programs, the programs, the programs, the programs for all of these years. Now what's going to happen with a lot of people when they get new into this, they're going to hear me speak one day and I'm going to say programs, projects, cults, and they're going to go, oh, programs like in that movie, very quickly, right? So there's a slight bit of an annoyance there. But
Well, I mean,
that's
it's pretty dang similar, though. It's all, and
well,
you
exactly right. For
whenever
obvious
you have, which I wouldn't fault anybody for saying that, because it's anybody that's got common sense and critical thinking can see that it's almost identically the exact same thing, and they've just made up a lot of different scenarios due to the trauma that they faced during these behavioral modification schools, and made it that they're special and that space is involved, and
yeah.
that they're the captain of a secret space program ship whenever they just went to one of these behavioral modification schools. Now, I'm not saying that everyone did. I think a very small percentage of them did, but the basis of this documentary and the school and the stories that are told there are the building blocks of the secret space program and super soldier testimony.
And my labs because of the military component, right? Because the military was doing it too. That and like that's always been one of the things that I've always kind of said. Like they didn't have to kidnap me or most of the people I knew in these programs, right? Like most of us were there, not necessarily in a willing sense, but definitely in a participation type sense. Not like they were taking us in the middle of the night and kidnapping us and hooding us and we didn't know where we were going and all of that stuff. There were things hidden from us. There were a lot of lies, but we kind of knew what was going on. And that's always been a major divergence, and this explains it very clearly, right? And I've always known that in my heart of hearts, and it's part of the reason why I've put the percentage on it that I always have. But this is the first time that I have a documentary where I can point to and say, see, right? Just like with what NASA has brought out with their Mars training and their moon-based training, so that they can go mine space asteroids. It's all been happening in underwater and in deserts, and all these people really do believe that they're actually on the moon, in Mars, in space, but it's a simulation. And yeah, so it's the same thing for me. It's just that it's, I've been speaking to it for a long time, and now I have a documentary where I can say, hey, go watch this. And does this sound a little bit more akin to what you think happened to you than you were sent to fight space aliens with some kind of space lasers or Mars and then just brought back here and sent to school the next day? Because that doesn't make much sense. Because but yeah, like, did you go away to one of these private schools in which a bunch of different traumatic experiences happened to you that involved a bunch of strangers, and you were, in all of those different situations? Because guess what? There were very real programs operating in the broad daylight that were doing exactly that. So the military ones, again, with the My Lab, because that's a lot of the abduction stories, is bright lights in the middle of the night, people coming into their room, taking them away, bringing them back, right? And so that's what a lot of that was, is they would take you away, they would threaten you, tell you that if you didn't do everything your parents told you, you were going to have to go into the military, and then they would bring you back. And, forget about that, or be a traumatized child, make the behavioral modification, live underneath that behavioral modification, and then someday you're listening on to someone on the internet describe a scenario where the same thing happened to them, except for instead of just behavioral modification, they got to go to outer space and be a superhero. Which are you going to choose? Right? You're obviously going to choose the one that results in you being a superhero. So there's a lot of different ways in which people get themselves to that point. And so that's why I've always put the percentages on them. This is just more kind of proof in the result of why I've done that.
The basis, yeah, exactly. You explained it perfectly. That from the very beginning of these programs, I'm sure that maybe a few people, maybe one or two people that's actively talking about the secret space program have been through one of these behavioral modification schools. Maybe. It's a big maybe, but it's definitely someone has. Someone has been through one of these behavioral modification schools. Now, it's a possibility that one of these secret space program people just heard another person talk about it and then made up their story on top of hearing another person speak about it. That's a
It's a
possibility too.
burrito, right? Yeah, and that's just it. And that's what I was saying about, the burrito then becomes really enticing, because if you see someone on a stage talking about a program, you were in, just to say, full well that you were in Ivy Ridge Academy, specifically, the very school from this documentary. But then you hear, I'll pick someone that I actually like, Max Spears, talking about his experiences. It's going to be so easy to do that hop, skip, and jump from, you are Max Spears. You went through all the same stuff he did because he's talking about some similar things. You can fit it into your bucket and therefore adopt it as your identity as well. Go out and build yourself that conspiracy burrito, because now you have a foundational, like, you have the wrap to put it in, with the fact that you have these memories too. And then, again, like, I put the percentage of speakers that are bullshitting higher than the audience that's listening, because I think that there are more people who are just quiet in the audience who have been through real programs, who probably were just as annoyed by this as I was.
Well, the scenarios that are described in these documentaries are verbatim identical to the beginning stories of any secret space program whistleblower. They're abducted as a child, they're taken out of their home by people in a blacked out van. They're driven to a facility, they're MK Ultra, they're mind controlled, they're programmed, they're deprogrammed and then reprogrammed. And it's just that everything that happens after the MK Ultra is made up, it's delusion. Because they say, well, after I was MK Ultra and mind fractured, and then I went to space for 20 years and went to Mars and fought aliens, and then was age regressed back in time to 20 years, and then I'm here. Instead of, yeah, my parents paid these behavioral modification schools to abduct me, take me to a facility where I was tortured, where I was subjected to brainwashing tactics, and graduated from that school, and then went back home, tried to tell my parents about it, and my parents didn't believe me. I mean,
And
which story do you want to go with?
but then a few years later, I was watching Gaia TV and
Mm.
I saw David Wilcock and Corey Goode. And when I heard Corey Goode talk about that experience, I thought to myself, well, maybe while I was at Ivy Ridge, they did send me into space for 20 years and just regressed me and put me back. Right? Maybe maybe that is what happened. And then that becomes, no, that is what happened. And then the next thing you know, you've got a fucking YouTube channel and you're telling everybody that's what happened to you. And yeah, that I think happens here.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I mean, when I was watching the documentary, I was like, this is what that's what all of them are saying. I'm looking at my girlfriend. I'm like, what is this? Because she's familiar with what I'm doing and what I've been doing. And I was like, this is what they all say. I'll say
Well,
this
it's weird.
exact same thing, but that doesn't confirm that they actually all went through one of these programs. Like I said, it's someone did. At least one person did, or one person heard somebody else talk about it and then created and manipulated and exaggerated the story and mystified the story and turned it into a fairy tale spaceland opera.
Well, that's where how it got added into it is basically it, right? Like the conspiracy burrito that is the secret space program is something that you have been doing a lot of work to show has been built over time. This is where that particular ingredient came from. It came from these schools that were actually doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it makes complete and total sense, and I recommend that anybody watch this documentary, the program, cons, cults, and kidnapping. And I was really mind blown that Netflix allowed this to really even come out. But they've been doing a lot of good stuff here recently. They just came out with American Conspiracy, the Octopus Murders. Unbelievable rabbit hole. Holy shit, dude. Wild. It's about this guy that had a contract with the Department of Justice to create this computer program that would relate all of these criminal cases and find relations with each case. And it was basically like a surveillance type program. And then the Department of Justice bankrupts him, steals the software, and then puts a back door into the software and then sells that software to all the different other countries' intelligence communities. So that way they can spy on what all the other countries are using the program and the software for.
Yeah. Yeah, if you come up with a good idea, someone's going to steal that and use it for a bad idea. It's the way that things go. And yeah, it's even these programs are the same thing. Like the one that like the emphasis they're trying to make with Hell Camp about how kids these days do need more discipline and more responsibility, and doing hard things does help them learn that. But obviously crossing that line is what they can point to. It's the same thing with the reason why I think Netflix is doing this is because they operate in the left wing hemisphere of the world that people are now so appropriately calling a cult. And so the more that they can put examples of cults out there that look like Jonestown or look like this or look like Charles Manson, the less the average person will look at that other thing and say that's a cult too, because it doesn't seem as extreme. So it's the play on words. It's the same thing with the play on words with the program. It's the same thing they're doing with words like gender or race or all kinds of different things in our world right now. It's just the parts of it that touch our community and our type of research.
Yeah, I've recognized that as well, and it makes sense as like deception operation. That's what Richard Doty. That's what Richard Doty calls it now. Shane,
Yeah,
deception
yeah,
operation, which makes sense. How words have double meanings and how words. The public thinks that a word means one thing whenever people say it, but it actually means another thing. That's
yeah.
what I've really realized with a lot of the buzzwords that are rolling around today. They all have double and triple meanings. It's the public that puts the meaning onto it for themselves. They're not telling you what these buzzwords mean, like crash retrieval, like Nash
Biologics.
biologics, national security threat, alien
Domestic
invasion.
terrorism. Insurrection. There's one, right? Like riot. There's another one that doesn't mean what it used to mean. There's all sorts of them in the world today that we can see. And this, like I said, these are just the ones that are touching our community.
Yeah, and I've realized that a lot of them mean something completely separate. And
I don't see a lot of sorry, I don't see a lot of comments, so I want to comment on this. Whatever takes you away from family, good or bad family and friends is a huge red flag. I very much agree with that. You know, you don't have to like all of your family, but your family is your family, and there's still a bond there that we've learned to break that obviously a lot of us have had shitty families, so this is hard to hear right now, but we've had that shitty family because that bond started breaking a while ago. So I very much agree with that comment. And I don't usually see the comments very often, so I just wanted to point that out.
Oh, we got a lot here. Yeah, you want to learn to distinguish between being lonely and being alone. Happy with your own company. Absolutely.
Hell yeah.
Absolutely. That is really important because there is a huge difference between being lonely and being alone. You can be alone without being lonely.
Yep. You could be lonely and not be alone. I had a friend, he was a kind of an odd dude, but he grew up living in Toronto his whole life, and he would always say it was the loneliest place in the world. And I'm like, it's a city full of 3 million people. How are you lonely? He's like, this is the loneliest place I've ever been. Interesting.
Very interesting. Noble truth. Some of us were adopted and don't have that bond as well. I'd assume they target adopted kids. Yeah, that's a part of this cons, cults, and
There's a whole other
kidnapping
program.
documentary. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a whole other version of the same type of thing that they were running, but it was for specifically adopted kids. And yeah, the amount of those kids who have gone missing and ended up into books about UFO abductions and Sasquatch is actually something to consider as well.
The missing 411 people.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a section in this documentary that the documentary filmmaker called a. I spoke about it earlier, but I think it's important to bring up again. It called a adoption, a behavioral modification program that was for adopted kids. And she was trying to get more. She was pretending to be somebody else, and she was trying to get more information out of the receptionist that she was talking to on the phone. And it turned out that she was like, "Oh well, what if my adopted kid doesn't want to go willingly?" Because she was trying to get to the point that they're coming in and kidnapping and abducting these kids. And this lady was like, "Oh well, there's another company that you can pay that will come and get them." And then she was like, "Oh, what if I don't have the money to do that?" And she was like, "Oh, well, the state of California will pay for this essentially kidnapping and an abduction of your child."
Yeah, and I mean, like the human trafficking element, like the kids from other countries. So they were bringing kids from other countries and running them through behavioral modifications under the guise of they were acclimatizing them to our culture, right? If you have like a 6, 7-year-old kid come from Africa, or a teenager, let's say, come from Africa, putting them through into these programs so that they become American was another selling feature that another way that they would get parents to give their children to these. And so, yeah, like all of the different human trafficking that we found out through things like the Epstein Island, also like, what's going on, say, with the border, organ donation or organ harvesting, things of that nature, without even getting into, the more darker things. You can see how these organizations are the perfect cover for human trafficking, human smuggling, human disappearance, and also for testing behavioral modification programs that eventually, come the early 2000s, would be run out in the public via media campaigns, put into colleges, the public schools, colleges, and universities, put into everything, and was all tested real time on your kids. And thanks for paying us for it on top of it, too. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Wow, dude, the things that we have done that are just now coming to light. And there's a reason for that too. It's a reason that they're now coming out and saying all this stuff, and it was 30 years ago or 20 years ago or 15 years ago,
I
because
was
it's so
saying
far
that.
in the past. And it's
Yeah.
plausible deniability too, because they can be like, "Oh well, we're not doing that anymore, right? We did this in the past. We did this 15, 20 years ago.
The people are different, and Cat Williams nailed it too. The other part of what I say, because I get asked this question all the time because it's Illuminati based. I'm like, they've rebranded. They're the umbrella corporation, as I call them now. It's all different. Their recruitment is different, and a lot of the older people are dying off. And so you can't just get in the same way that you used to, and you don't just get out the same way you used to either, because it's more interconnected with all of us. So yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So what was it? What did I just comment about? What did I just say? I had something to follow up on it with, but I just lost it.
We were talking about yeah, I can't remember exactly what you were saying, because I started thinking about the they can't get away with doing things this way anymore, but they still do them, right? Like there's
Oh
these
yeah, yeah, yeah. All the time lapse in between them revealing what they were doing before. It's just like the MK Ultra programs, right? If you went to a normal person on the street and you were like, "Oh, hey," that doesn't know anything about this, it isn't steeped in this community, and you'd be like, "Hey, the CIA was doing mind control and brainwashing in the early '50s and it ran into the '70s, right?" And they'll be like, "Oh, well, yeah, but they're not doing it anymore." That's what I like about this documentary, because not only there was a big emphasis on that it's still happening, that is still going on, that there's these programs all over the United States in all these different countries, and they're still happening to this very day. They made a point to make sure that they still said that, because if they didn't, then it could just be kind of brushed off in a way that people will just think, oh well, yeah, they did that 15, 20 years ago, whatever, they're not doing it anymore. Just like my example with the MK Ultra programs, right? Yeah,
yeah,
they might have done that, Shane. They might have done it before. But
but
no
they
way they're
stopped,
doing it now.
and we
Yeah.
got a bunch of unclear documentation from them about it. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. It's
Yeah.
fine. Same with even Project Stargate is another one of those where it's just like, wait a second, you guys were doing what? And then you passed it off to the CIA and DARPA, and the Russians were doing what? And wait a second, what'd you guys learn? Right? What'd you guys learn, and what have you been doing to us? Like, is there some reason why mass formation is so easy for you guys to throw us into? Did you study something and not tell us about it? Uh-huh, they did.
Yeah. And that's another thing too, is a lot of these names of these programs have been turned into fairy tale nonsense stories so that the real program nobody knows about. It's the same way with Pegasus. Same way with
Oh,
the Pegasus program. Like people have said, "Oh, the MK Ultra turned into Project Pegasus, and it was like a time traveling program." And like all, no, Project Pegasus is a freaking spy software that people can buy to hack into your freaking phone to listen to every single thing that you're doing. That's what Project Pegasus is, and it's the same way with the Stargate program, and which I've done so much research and study into the Stargate program, and also with Operation Looking Glass. These people are like, "Oh, Operation Looking Glass is an advanced government technology that lets you see into the future and see into the past, and the United States has got one, and other countries have got one, Germany, Russia, and all this stuff." And no, the Operation Looking Glass was a real Air Force operation, was to put a freaking nuclear command post in space.
my favorite, and I've been tracking this one since the about 19, I think like 96, is the people who look into the future and can't see past a certain date, because that date just keeps rolling back. Just keeps rolling back. Just keeps rolling back. Just keeps rolling back, even out of the same people's mouth. It's very much like David Wilcock waiting for the Alliance to save us, and like that date, how it keeps rolling back. But this psychics not being able to see past a certain date in the future has been going on for as long as I've been alive. It's been pretty hilarious. But
Yeah.
anyways,
That's just code for they can't make anything else up. That they're at the end of their imagination.
in some cases, I think that that is true.
I
Or
used
it's
up all of my creativity and all my creative juice in telling you about the first 20 years in the future.
yeah, or they are just short-sighted and they think that they've picked a date far enough into the future that they'll never get caught, and then that date comes up and they're like, "Oh no, oh no, we're gonna have to roll this back."
Yep. Got to make it further and further in the future. That's the way that it's easiest way to do it. Don't make your prediction for next week, next month, next year, and next 5 years. You got to make it way further.
Yeah. But yeah, and then there's a level of that is happening with this being called the program, which is that mild bit of annoyance that has been outweighed by the good that actually will come from this. I do consider this a win, despite the fact that we called what I went through programs, and that's not it. So there's like that a little bit, but it's also because I've always taken the stance that most of the people who think that they've actually been in programs have really maybe at best been in one of those, and that most of them are just making shit up anyways. That's why this is a win all of the same. So I'll take it.
I agree. You got any last things to add before we wrap up here today?
No, man, I'm cool. I'm good. I talked to a friend of mine who's a pretty big alien and conspiracy theory guy was in Miami when that all went down, and he went over to the mall and very much confirmed that all of the rioting that was going on in the mall continued out onto the sidewalks, such as them lighting off fireworks out there and smoke bombs and no aliens. And in fact, that was not even a buzzword around the thing. Nobody there was saying anything about aliens. He learned about that on Twitter. So, firsthand experience, had to find out about the aliens on Twitter. So there you go.
Yep, and it's amazing that you can just change the preconceived notion of what an alien is by just adding one word in front of it. Takes on a completely different new meaning.
Illegal? Like all
They're
like the 50 people who got arrested and we never got names out of?
they're always here. They've always been here,
Yeah.
and they're all around us.
Exactly, and it's a big fucking excuse me for my language again, but it's a big problem right now, like a really, really, really big million body, billion body problem right now. And yeah, imagine that.
They're definitely extraterrestrial, and extraterrestrial meaning from
A
other
different,
land.
yeah, a different other land. Yeah,
What's below us and what's above us? Other land.
other land.
Amazing. Well, I encourage anybody to watch this documentary, the program Cons, Cults, and Kidnapping, and hopefully we did it some justice. I feel really good talking about it because I've been kind of had it bundled up this entire time, and I really wanted to chat about it, and hopefully we did a good job. And if you haven't watched it yet and you get a chance to watch it, please do, and then come back and comment on the show. And let us know what you thought of it. And I don't know which one I would recommend actually watching. I would probably say watch that one
If you're
first
only going to
before.
watch one, watch the program. The other one is just if you want a little bit more of the origin story and another look at it, watch the other one then.
Yeah, because Hell Camp is definitely not as brutal as the program Cons, Cults, and Kidnapping. They're different. The first one tries to kind of glorify the man that created the programs and doesn't really get into the abuse aspects of it. But the program Cons, Cults, and Kidnapping definitely does, and they have video proof and documentation of really everything that they talk about, which is astounding. Normally, when a documentary of that caliber gets made, it's a lot of hyperbole and conjecture and theory that's tossed into it. But almost everything that they talk about, they have documentation to back it up and video proof to back it up.
Well, it was one of those things where it looks like she started off making a movie that was this big, and then in the process of doing that, ended up uncovering so much more. Like a lot of that footage they found at the place when they finally went there, right? And a lot of the records. So she was looking at something that was going to be this big, but in the process of doing that, it became that big. So, good job to her. That was probably very tough for them all to do, to be honest. Can relate to that. So, yeah, definitely check it out if you haven't. You would probably enjoy it if you're watching this.
Thanks so much, Shane. Appreciate your time this evening. Let people know where they can find you.
The internets. What was it? Linktree after the / Shane_Sador. You'll find it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Links to Shane information will be in the description of this video. Thank you all so much for being here with us. Noble Truth. Good to see you, my friend. Thanks for being a channel member. Appreciate you and being a moderator. And Anne, thank you so much for being a Ryder Ranger channel member as well. Sandra, good to see you. And anybody else that was in the chat that contributed to the conversation, thank you guys so much for being here. Really appreciate it. A new channels member only episode will be dropping tomorrow, so become a Ryder Ranger channel member to get access to that video. Please be sure to hit the thumbs up button to help the channel in their algorithm. Share, subscribe, hit the bell icon as well for notifications. See you guys next time.